Hello, my name's Emily, and I'm reaching out because I'm completely lost. It's been 2 weeks since my husband, Jake, packed up and left without a single word, and he hasn't picked up any of my calls since. I'd be panicking if it weren't for the fact that I know he's been checking in on our son at school. Somehow, he's decided to avoid me entirely, which is tearing me apart because I can't shake the feeling it's all my fault. It happened 2 weeks ago when Jake's mom was over for dinner. We were all cooking together, laughing over stories about Jake's childhood, especially his shy, serious nature as a kid. She mentioned that he used to be embarrassed about bathing with his brothers because they teased him for being smaller than them. Without thinking, I laughed along and made a joke. Well, he hasn't exactly grown much since then. It was supposed to be playful, but the moment the words left my mouth, I saw Jake's expression change. He stiffened, looked at me with disbelief, and just left. He drove off, and since then, I haven't seen him once. Now, here I am, with our son asking why Dad hasn't come home. I've been texting Jake, calling, even leaving messages with his mom, but he's avoiding me at every turn. I can't wrap my head around it. I didn't mean it in a hurtful way, I thought we could joke like that. But now he's avoiding me as if I'd shattered everything we'd built together. Jake and I have been married for 10 years, and though it's been mostly wonderful, I think we're different in ways that sometimes make us misunderstand each other. I've always been more outspoken, while Jake's a quiet, reserved person who doesn't often show his feelings. We grew up in the same neighborhood, but it wasn't until college that we actually became friends. I was always the extrovert, getting into trouble now and then, while he was the studious one. People warned their kids not to hang out with me, and Jake was someone who rarely strayed from the rules. After high school, our paths were on hold for a while. I stayed back to help my mom, who was battling cancer. That year was one of the hardest I'd ever faced, but luckily, she pulled through. When I finally made it to college, Jake was there too, and our friendship grew in ways I never expected. Through every challenge, he was my rock, supporting me and pushing me to do better, especially when things got tough. And now, after everything we've been through, he's gone, all because of something I said without thinking. I'm just so lost, RedHead, I don't know what to do, and I can't bear to think this might be the end of our marriage. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much Jake and I went through before we even became a couple. After high school, my life turned upside down when my mom was diagnosed with cancer. The entire family went into survival mode, every cent going toward her treatment. Those were dark days. I couldn't focus on anything outside of Mom's recovery, so I had to put off college while I helped take care of her. When Mom finally started to heal, it felt like a miracle. Slowly, we started piecing our lives back together, and I finally enrolled in college. That's when I ran into Jake again. College was different from high school. There, Jake and I had a clean slate. He was still the serious, thoughtful guy I remembered, but we both had changed. I wasn't the wild girl I used to be, and he'd come out of his shell a little, opening up in ways he hadn't before. We gravitated toward each other, finding a balance in our personalities. Even though we weren't taking the same classes, he somehow became my unofficial tutor. I wasn't the studious type, I was more interested in the social scene, going to parties and joining clubs. But Jake was my grounding force. He'd patiently go over my notes with me before exams, practically dragging me through subjects I'd otherwise have failed. Without him, I honestly don't think I'd have made it through college. At the time, we were just friends, though I think Jake had feelings for me long before I realized mine. According to him, he'd had a crush on me since high school, but he was too shy to say anything. I never suspected it, though. I dated a couple of guys back then, and Jake was always there to pick up the pieces when things went south. After one particularly rough breakup, it was Jake who got me back on my feet, cheering me up and reminding me that I deserved better. I guess you could say he was always there, waiting for me to realize what I had. Eventually, after college, I moved in with him for a while, not out of romantic interest but just because I needed a place. I didn't want to go back to my parents' house, and Jake welcomed me with open arms. Over time, I saw sides of him I hadn't noticed before, his loyalty, his patience, his quiet way of making me feel safe. I began to wonder if he was the one I'd been looking for all along. But now, remembering everything he's done for me, the thought of losing him feels unbearable. I can't believe something so small could lead to this much distance between us. Jake was always the one constant in my life, the person who stayed even when others left. And now, he's the one who's gone. After college, when I moved in with Jake, I'd only seen him as a friend. I was fresh out of school, struggling to find my footing, and Jake had this calm stability that was a relief after years of chaos. At first, it was just a temporary arrangement. I figured I'd stay with him for a month or two while I got a job and saved up for my own place. But months went by, and moving out never crossed my mind. Being around him felt easy, natural, and he never once made me feel like I was overstaying my welcome. I'd started noticing little things about Jake that I hadn't seen before. He was incredibly disciplined, constantly working hard in his metal workshop. He crafted these beautiful, intricate pieces, the kind that looked like they belonged in a museum. People loved his work, and seeing his dedication made me admire him even more. It wasn't just his talent, it was the way he poured himself into everything he did. He was so serious about his craft, often working late into the night, completely absorbed in his work. I respected his focus, something I'd never quite mastered myself. One weekend, Jake surprised me by mentioning he'd started dating someone. Her name was Isabella, and when she came over, I suddenly felt like an outsider. Watching them together stirred up feelings I didn't expect. For the first time, I realized I wanted to be the one beside him. I'd thought it was just jealousy at first, but when Isabella started staying over more often, I found myself avoiding them, hiding away in my room until she left. Eventually, I couldn't deny what I felt for him. But Jake was loyal to a fault, and he'd never guessed that his old friend had fallen for him. I thought he'd be able to pick up on the hints I'd started dropping, the small gestures, the longing looks. But Jake wasn't like other guys. He wasn't going to make assumptions or read too much into things. It frustrated me, and I finally had to take Jakers into my own hands. One night, I gathered the courage to tell him. I said I wanted us to be more than friends, to give a relationship a try. I remember the way he looked at me, eyes wide with surprise, like he'd never even considered it. But when he pulled me close and kissed me, everything else faded away. From that moment, we were inseparable. Dating Jake felt like a dream. He was everything I hadn't known I needed, thoughtful, devoted, always going out of his way to make me feel special. He'd pick me up after work, take me out to dinner when I was too tired to cook, and leave little surprises around the house to brighten my day. Every relationship I'd had before him paled in comparison. With Jake, I felt seen, loved, and supported in a way I never had before. After a year and a half of dating, Jake proposed. It was the most romantic night of my life. I came home to find our families gathered, Jake on one knee with a ring in his hand. I was so overwhelmed, I hugged him before I even accepted the ring. That night marked the start of a life I thought would last forever. And now, the thought of losing it all over one careless comment feels devastating. Our wedding was a simple, beautiful day with only family and close friends. Jake and I were so sure of each other then, like nothing could shake the foundation we'd built. After the ceremony, we went on a honeymoon to Paris, a dream trip we'd saved up for. It was magical, wandering the city together, sharing quiet dinners, and getting lost in narrow streets that seemed to go on forever. I remember feeling like I'd found everything I'd ever wanted. But there were some things I hadn't expected. Even on our honeymoon, there was an awkwardness between us, especially when it came to physical closeness. I could sense Jake's hesitation, his nervousness, even though he tried hard to make everything perfect for me. For the first time, I noticed he was shy in ways I hadn't seen before, holding back just enough that I felt it. When we were finally alone, I realized he wasn't as confident or experienced as I'd assumed. He was clumsy, uncertain, and while he was sweet and loving, I found myself feeling a sense of disappointment that I tried to ignore. I told myself that intimacy wasn't everything, that the love we shared would more than make up for it. And in many ways, it did. Jake's thoughtfulness, his patience, and his deep devotion meant everything to me. I never questioned his love, even when there were things I felt I couldn't talk to him about. For a while, I was able to bury those feelings, to push aside any dissatisfaction. I knew how much Jake loved me, and I wanted to focus on all the good things we had. I kept telling myself that no marriage is perfect, that I was lucky to have someone as loyal and caring as Jake. But after a few years, those hidden disappointments started to creep up on me again. I met a friend, Rachel, who became my confidant. She'd often talk about her relationship, how she and her boyfriend were so passionate and connected. Listening to her, I felt a pang of jealousy, a reminder of something I'd been trying to ignore. I never told Rachel about my own frustrations, but her stories made me realize what I was missing. It was like a door had been opened to feelings I'd long buried, and I wasn't sure how to close it. As the years went on, I tried to focus on the life we'd built. We were building a family, a home, and a future. But that lingering feeling, that emptiness, never really went away. And now, looking back, I wonder if that was where I started to let go of the love that Jake and I had once shared. I was beginning to crave something I couldn't quite name, and part of me feared it would come at a cost I wasn't ready to face. By the time we reached our 10th anniversary, I felt like something was missing in my life. Jake was still the same loving, dependable husband, but that lingering emptiness had grown stronger. I found myself craving excitement, something to break up the routine, and started looking for hobbies that would keep me busy. That's when I stumbled into a local pottery class. It seemed innocent enough, just a way to pass the time and do something creative. I never expected it would become the beginning of my biggest mistake. The instructor, Derek, or D, as he liked to be called, had a confidence and charm that immediately drew me in. He was the opposite of Jake, bold, self-assured, and intense. When he'd help me with a technique, his hands would hover just close enough to make my heart race. I convinced myself it was harmless, just a bit of excitement I needed to shake up my life. But soon, my attraction to D was undeniable. One evening after class, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink, and I hesitated, knowing that line should never be crossed. But I found myself saying yes, telling myself it was nothing serious. I wouldn't let it go further than a casual drink with a friend. But as we sat in that dimly lit bar, sipping wine and sharing stories, the chemistry between us was impossible to ignore. When he leaned in and kissed me, I didn't stop him. In that moment, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I tried to tell myself it was a one-time thing, something I'd brush off as a brief mistake. But it didn't stop there. The thrill of sneaking away, of lying to Jake about my whereabouts, began to consume me. I found myself meeting D whenever I could, caught between guilt and exhilaration. I hated the lies, hated that I was betraying Jake, yet I couldn't seem to pull myself away. Each time, I told myself it was the last, that I'd go back to my normal life. But every time I tried to stop, I found myself drawn back in. Eventually, D started asking me for money. At first, he said it was just a loan to help him out with bills, but the requests kept coming. My savings dwindled quickly, and I knew I was in over my head. When I told him I couldn't keep giving him money, he dropped a bombshell. He had taken a photo of us together in his apartment and threatened to send it to Jake if I didn't continue. I was trapped, terrified that everything I'd worked for, everything Jake and I had built, would come crashing down. I wanted to tell Jake, to finally be honest and take responsibility for what I'd done. But I couldn't bring myself to face the truth, terrified of how he would look at me if he knew. So, I kept the secret, carrying the weight of my mistakes in silence. I tried to keep up the charade, to act like everything was fine, even as I felt my marriage slipping further out of reach. Then, that fateful night with Jake's mom came, and my careless comment about him set everything into motion. I hadn't meant it to hurt him, but the moment I saw the pain flash across his face, I knew I'd finally crossed a line I couldn't uncross. After Jake left that night, I was beside myself with regret. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind, trying to figure out how a careless comment, one I thought would come across as a joke, had gone so horribly wrong. I texted him, called him repeatedly, and even reached out to his family, but Jake didn't respond. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, I felt my guilt tighten around me like a noose. I was haunted by the look on his face when he walked out, as if I'd shattered something deep inside him. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Jake came back, but he wasn't the same man I knew. He looked at me with a mixture of hurt and disgust that I'd never seen before. He handed me a stack of papers, and as I realized they were divorce papers, my heart sank. I tried to reach out to him, to beg for forgiveness, but he stopped me cold. In silence, he pulled out his phone and showed me a photo, the photo Dee had threatened to send. My stomach dropped. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper, but his words hit like a hammer. I waited, Emily. I waited to see if you'd tell me the truth, he said, his eyes filled with betrayal. But instead, you just kept lying. His disappointment was palpable, and I felt myself breaking down, knowing there was nothing I could say to make it right. He had given me chances to come clean, to be honest, and I'd let each one slip away. There was no argument, no dramatic scene, just a quiet, agonizing acceptance that I'd destroyed everything we had. Jake didn't yell, didn't ask for explanations. He simply gathered his things, leaving me to face the wreckage of my own choices. As he walked out the door, I realized that, this time, he was gone for good. That was months ago, and since then, my life has been a hollow shell of what it once was. Our son prefers staying with Jake or his grandparents, avoiding me more often than not. My family has distanced themselves, and Jake's family wants nothing to do with me. Dee is now in jail, having blackmailed other women the same way he did me, leaving me with nothing but the consequences of my own actions. I traded a decade of love and trust for a moment of excitement, and now I'm left to live with the loss of everything that Jakered to me. All I have left are the memories of a life I threw away and the regret that I'll carry for the rest of my life.